Will meeting Vladimir Putin really be the easy part? That quip was by Donald Trump on Tuesday. It raised the curtain on a European tour that began in Brussels with a NATO summit where the Atlantic Alliance's biggest contributor has since singled out Germany for criticism. More on that in a moment. Trump's gone so far as to wonder whether NATO's obsolete in the past. Is the United States losing interest in enforcing what scholars call the Pax Americana? So after Brussels, there'll be Britain on Friday. Protesters there hard at work on the reception they'll be giving Trump. Trump, who's blown hot and cold when it comes to the UK, offering the British a reward for exiting the European Union, a post-Brexit zero-tariff trade deal, says his ambassador. Trump riling his future host, though, in London with his praise of Boris Johnson the day after the UK Foreign Secretary quit Theresa May's government. Why is the President of the United States effectively rooting for a hard Brexit? Which brings us to next Monday in Helsinki and that first one-on-one summit with Vladimir Putin. What political theater awaits there? Today in the France 24 debate, Trump takes on NATO. And with us, he's France's former defense minister, Socialist Senator Alain Richard. Thank you for being with us.
I have changed parties 1 year ago.
Oh, you did? Excuse me.
I'm favorable to President Macron.
No, you're with La République En Marche,
Exactly.
the party.
I've been re-elected as such.
Okay, all right. Well, my bad. Apologies for that. Also joining us, Annick Cizel. She lectures on transatlantic relations at Paris's Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
From Washington, D.C., journalist and commentator Molly McHugh is with us, just back from Estonia. We'll be talking perhaps about that a little bit later on. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, it was a startling scene we saw earlier. Donald Trump speaking in the company of the NATO Secretary General.
Why are countries in NATO, namely Germany, having a large percentage of their energy needs paid, to Russia and taken care of by Russia? Now, if you look at it, Germany is a captive of Russia.
The strength of NATO is that despite these differences, we have always been able to unite around our core task to protect and defend each other, because we understand that we are stronger together than apart.
But how can you be together when a country is getting its energy from the person you want protection against or from the group that you want protection?
Because you understand that when we stand together, also when dealing with Russia, we are stronger. I think what we have seen is that...
No, you're just making Russia richer.
Making Russia richer. Alain Richard, your reaction to that exchange?
Well, it's in the fringe of the NATO real meeting. And what is important in my view is what are the political decisions collectively taken by NATO leaders. This is a side discussion.
But it's more than just a side discussion. It's the President of the United States
opinion.
singling out Germany at a NATO summit.
Well, that's, basic rhetorics. President Trump is original by many ways. And one of the original schemes he has is to mix different subjects, to mix different areas of policy. It's not crazy, by the way, to show Germany that they have areas of, I would say, complacency in their relationship with Russia, whereas they are strong Atlantic allies. So the way he puts it is, blunt, to say the least. But he has a point.
He has a point, you say.
But it's not the central business of NATO.
It's not the central business of NATO.
We should keep to the strategic issues.
Should keep to the strategic issues, although the German Chancellor, because of those remarks, forced to issue a rebuttal before she sat down in a sidebar meeting with Trump.
I myself have also experienced a part of Germany being occupied by the Soviet Union. I am very glad that we are united today in freedom as the Federal Republic of Germany, and that we can therefore also say that we can make our own policies and make our own independent decisions.
Molly McHugh, you heard Alain Richard say that on the point of how much Germany contributes to NATO, Trump may have a point. Trump, who, by the way, went further, singling out Merkel's predecessor, Gerhard Schroeder, who is now a top executive at the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which avoids the Balkans and relays Russian gas to Germany. Do you agree with Alain Richard?
You know, I actually think that the talking points from the president this morning indicate that someone put together the right memo for him. And despite the fact that his aides looked really uncomfortable, they were all sort of looking in the corner, trying not to make eye contact with their counterparts at NATO, I think the points, they knew the president was going to go into NATO with these points. People aren't spending enough on their defense, in particular Germany, one of the largest members of the alliance that is, in his mind, underspending more than others. And they sort of wrapped that in these other points about Russian interference in the alliance, about the influence of Russian money in politics across Europe, in the business landscape, and how that changes the way that we all think. And even though the president delivered it in sort of this heavy-handed, not really so suave way, the core messaging, which is Russia's influencing NATO and the EU and the United States in a variety of ways that we need to pay more attention to because it creates vulnerabilities for us, is not incorrect. And in this instance, I actually think it was good staff work on the part of whoever was preparing the president for the alliance.
Is that Donald Trump buttressing those Balkan states that are wary of Russia's influence by pointing out the reliance on relative reliance, you might say, on Russian natural gas in Germany, or is it just having a go at Germany because right now there's a trade dispute?
I think in the president's mind, this is not something that's so much about Russia. I think we have plenty of surprises yet to come in that category the rest of the week, as this was about Germany and about finding a way to point out that there's concrete things on which Germany needs to take steps and address other measures. But again, in this instance, I think it was clever staffing in the way of they knew he was going to take a swing at Germany, so here's a way to do it where he ends up looking like he's actually taking a swing at Russia too. Whether they can keep him on that message is going to be an interesting task, but the point about Russian energy influence, Russian financial influence, and the sort of creeping influence of Russian money in all of our societies is not a stupid one to make.
Annick Cizel?
Well, at the same time, as definitely there's the trade dispute, which is in the background, most definitely. But at the same time, it's extremely ironic. It's like Donald Trump is pursuing in front of the rest of the world the arbitration he's lost within his own administration. In the last week, 10 days, we had the Washington Post leaking out that the Defense Department was, just like they do every other year or something, monitoring the number of troops in Germany and possibly threatening, at least this is what John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to President Trump, and President Trump were hinting at, that they would be withdrawing U.S. troops from Germany this 10 days within NATO summit. Then it was arbitrated down, I was going to say, by the Defense Department, by Secretary of Defense Mattis, who said, no way. And we are building up from what the February 2018 Council of Ministers meeting of NATO had prepared for, which is not just not scaling down our troops, US troops in Germany, but actually building up NATO in Germany and opening in Ulm in Germany a joint support enabling command, which is one more NATO command at the heart of Europe in Germany, which was confirmed during the press conference 2 hours ago by Secretary General Stoltenberg, that definitely all NATO allies have been agreeing to NATO reinforcing its command structure in Norfolk, in Virginia, but also in Germany.
So hang on, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that Trump was pressured by his own administration to stick with NATO.
Exactly. Definitely by Secretary of Defense Mattis. And it's interesting in the pictures we saw here to see where Mike Pompeo was looking. And he was not looking at his own president. He was definitely trying, so the Secretary of State was trying to avoid the conversation visibly ill at ease, because it seems that the administration is facing up. The National Security Advisor, John Bolton, was against any further step within Germany for the US, but it seems at this stage that no troops are being pulled out or redeployed elsewhere, and it's more than that. It's definitely a defeat on day one for President Trump, which definitely explains why he had to go at Angela Merkel first thing, because this is President Trump. He has his temper, and he was faced with a Secretary General of NATO who told him, well, this is it. We are stepping up NATO, meaning US military command within NATO, on German soil, which is definitely, he's losing face on this one.
And Richard, who calls the shots on defense in Washington? Is it the president, or is it his defense secretary? He's a consummate Pentagon man, a former general?
Well, I'm not an explorer, so my assessment of
But do you draw the same conclusions as any
my assessment is a bit, distant. But it's pretty clear that what I would call in Turkey the deep state is trying hard to monitor the president. Has been like that all the years. I mean, any new president has a lack of experience and lack of knowledge on the large range of issues.
So the French use the term military-industrial complex.
No, this is an Eisenhower's expression, by the way. No, it's not.
And you believe in that? You think that they're the ones who get the final say on this?
It's nothing to do with the industrial complex. It's what we call really the deep state. The people in charge of the permanent long-term interests of the security of any nation. And of course, these people are more powerful and better organized in the US than anywhere other. And they may be diverging between themselves. There are serious security and foreign policy disputes in Washington. But on what is essential, which is, of course, the credibility of NATO as an alliance and the credibility of the US as leader and organizer long-term of the alliance, they believe in that. We share this belief, by the way. And they would do whatever they can to prevent the president to destroy that, even if his, gossip is against.
All right. It was, as you were talking about the fact that, well, what is a NATO summit about? It's about an alliance of nations. It was in response to Russia's 2014 annexation of Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula that that alliance has put troops on rotation in Poland and in the Baltic states, like here in Estonia. It's also strengthened its presence in the Black Sea and sought to modernize its forces. It's also in 2014 that it instituted that 2% rule. Members of the alliance pledging to devote 2% of their national budgets to defense. Earlier in closed-door meetings, Trump suggesting that, in fact, be increased to 4%, to which the NATO Secretary General rebutted, well, let's first get to 2%. And as you can see from that graph, many of the countries, including France and Germany, are well below that mark. Molly McHugh, is NATO on the ropes right now, or is it in the process of redefining itself?
I think it's a little of both, but I think the acclaim this whole week of NATO being close to death was sort of hollowed out by the fact that I think everybody was aware Trump was going to come in with a mood, and he did, and he sent angry tweets as he boarded the plane. But he was met by a bunch of consummate professionals who understand the importance of this alliance to both the United States and Europe and all of our collective security, who nodded and smiled and took the abuse and praised him when asked to do so in order to keep the alliance together. And I think to the United States of America, that should send a pretty clear sign that our allies are in this with us in good times and in bad. And we all need to recommit. And as you mentioned, I just came back from Estonia, from the Baltic states. where I was talking across the region with people about their sort of security priorities and needs. And there really does need to be this transformation of the alliance, part of which is already underway in frontline states in terms of the territorial defense of NATO. For the last 15 years or so, we've been very focused on expeditionary wars, the missions in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. And for obvious reasons, those had to happen. But the focusing on the defense of the alliance, of our partners who are the most vulnerable within the alliance to the threats that we see as the preeminent threats against us, needs to occur. There's been a lot of shifting happening in this. Part of the agenda of the NATO summit was to look more at hybrid threats, things like cyber, not just hard military threats, but other potential threats to the alliance. And how the alliance should or should not be meeting those, like whose responsibility are these new threats, how can we respond collectively or individually to them. And I think we really do see leadership from especially some of the smaller NATO members like the Baltic states and Estonia on these issues, really leading the alliance forward in terms of innovation and repositioning. And that needs to happen, not just how much money we spend on things, but what we are focusing on in terms of...
Is Donald Trump up to the task?
Skills. I don't think Trump thinks about anything beyond the talking point in his head, which clearly is, are you spending enough money? How is the United States getting any of that? What does that mean for us? We all know that talking point about bottom line defense spending is very much part of his domestic bludgeon. And I don't think he's going to pivot off of it anytime soon. However, the alliance is endeavoring to give him the ability to come back and say, see, I made this better and let's all move on. And I think the hope is that when he loses interest in this talking point, then all the people behind him who are capable and have a good strategic mindset, including Secretary Mattis and others, can move into the space and continue to do the really excellent work they've actually been doing in the region across the European security theater in the last few years. It's just sort of hidden behind the fact that all of it is made very fragile by the president's tweets and comments and bad relationships with the leaders of many of our allies.
All right, let's bring in at this point Dave Desroches, who teaches at National Defense University in Washington. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Do you agree with Molly McHugh that, the NATO summit, we're hearing these remarks, the ones about Germany, the ones about calling on other nations to double their spending commitments, and that, it's just about managing what the president says, but actually speaking with the grown-ups in his administration about what actually has to be done?
Yeah, look, what the substance of what the president is asking for is consistent with American policy going back to the formation of the alliance. The cliche is that NATO was formed to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. And that's still there, but that implies an unequal burden on the United States. And successive American administrations have sought to get our European partners to play a larger role in their own defense. Your previous guest was exactly right. The countries of what Donald Rumsfeld called, New Europe are taking this more seriously because they've lived under oppression. They know the threat there. But this is not, the difference is one of tactics and tone. And sure, Donald Trump is a wild card, but what he's asking for is consistent with what you would have heard from Gerald Ford, from Jimmy Carter, from Bill Clinton.
Because when we saw him on the campaign trail before he was elected, he talked about drawing down troops around the U.S. troops around the world. He played to... there's a strong isolationist streak in a good part of his electorate, which is tired of campaigns abroad. And there has been the question on this side of the Atlantic, is America growing tired, these 30 years after the end of the Cold War, with enforcing, again, what scholars call the Pax Americana, Dave?
Well, look, isolationism has always been a present and somewhat strong strain of American foreign policy. The problem is the kind of people who watch France 24 are by definition foreign policy elites or aspirant elites. And so they miss out on this. These are the people who thought it was going to be a Hillary Clinton whitewash, and they miss out on the tension, on the great strain of isolation that's present in most of America. I was raised in Orange County, California, as was Mike Pompeo. And I was 23 years old before I learned that decadent and European were two different words. The president gets this better than the kind of people who write for the New York Times. But again, his aims are advancing American security interests, and NATO is a key point of doing that. This is a tactic because, quite frankly, successive American presidents have asked for partners to do more in a nice way, and they've been ignored. So I think this is a tactic to get their attention. It's not really a substantive shift.
And Cizel?
Most definitely, having spent the last 30 years studying the United States and living there for quite a few years, I will agree with the fact that public opinion in the United States is definitely isolationist and don't want to go into Syria, or don't want to go into any other conflict, again, especially not after Iraq. Now, within the administration, we need to look at the facts. And the facts are the defense budget has been going up and up and up ever since Donald Trump entered the White House. For fiscal year 2019, from September this year to September next year, we are more or less around $700 billion, which is the highest point we've had ever since the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Most definitely, the United States is not closing military bases as could have been with an isolationist president, but keeping them open, staffing them up, and modernizing its arsenal, whether it be Air Force, whether it be the Navy, since definitely within the fiscal year 2019 budget, President Trump asks the Navy to build 10 combat ships, possibly for the Pacific Ocean on the other side of the world. Most definitely modernizing the nuclear arsenal and also launching a space force. President Trump has told us as part of the Air Force possibly, and NATO has some things to say about this at the same time. Most definitely, since Donald Trump has entered the White House, which is 18 months ago, something like that, U.S. troops in Europe, stationed in Europe, and notably to the eastern flank of Europe on the Russian border, have been up 40%. These are NATO figures, quoted by the Secretary General of NATO this afternoon. So we need to, forget about whatever isolationism within the Trump administration. John Bolton, his national security advisor, is not Mr. Isolationism. We need to think interventionism. But yes, you are right. Not interventionism in the sense of internationalism, in the sense of the Pax Americana, not in the sense of diplomacy, not in the sense of dialogue with the allies or with the enemies, Iran being the best case in point here, but in the sense of building up the military force, getting ready for rapid deployment. The key words at this NATO summit
So hang on,
are readiness and mobility for allied military.
So the United States, despite what Donald Trump says, modernizing its military, but is it to go it alone, Alain Richard, in future campaigns?
This has always been a tendency in U.S. policy, using the alliance, but keeping all freedom to engage its own forces separately or independently. And when I was in office, when we were fighting in the Balkans, we had episodes during which some actions, some sets of strikes were delivered under NATO structure, and some other were actioned under U.S. separate leadership and command. So this is not new. And actually, for what NATO is going to become after this summit, I think that the feeling of interest for the U.S., of involvement, of implication in NATO will remain the same. This is a legend which has been developed by some commentators, sometimes by politicians who have their own agenda on the issue. But I think no one wants to dissolve NATO or to weaken it. The issue is...
Nobody, including Donald Trump. This is the one multilateral institution that...
It's not a multilateral institution, it's an alliance. An alliance where everyone finds his own interest. That's very different. I heard once Henry Kissinger defining in a few words, which were absolutely clear, what an alliance is. It's different of an international institution, which is a forum where you discuss with different points of view. The alliance is a military apparatus which is organized to help all the member nations to defend themselves. The real issue within NATO has been, since the end of Cold War, does NATO intervene or take action outside its geographical circle, which is North America and Europe, including East Europe. And we've been disputing, and France was, of course, very reluctant to the idea of NATO being used, for instance, in Iraq, in areas where we would intervene, not to defend Europe or the US and Canada. So what is going now, because of Russian attitude, is that we come back to the basic mission of NATO, which is defensive and geographically limited.
Even though, Molly McHugh, there's all these questions about the Russia investigation and all of this, this is something completely different?
I think for President Trump, these things are all mixed up together, and the word Russia sort of sends him into a wild tic about whatever he decides to change the subject with. I think that there are serious strategic shifts that need to happen within the alliance. The focus back on territorial defense as a core mission, the focus on rebuilding sort of cohesiveness within the alliance, on readiness and mobilization, the ability of the alliance to move within itself. As much as Russia likes to scream and bluster about NATO deploying troops within NATO territory, we're allowed to do that, and we do need to position assets where they're going to be needed most. And I think there is a lot of debate about what that looks like now. We have been heavily focused on Germany as sort of the primary basing point of American troops in Europe for a long time, primarily because they kind of stopped there after World War II, and then we never really left. There's some debate about whether those should be moved forward to Poland, about how to do these things. None of this will be quick or fast. We have significant long-term, extremely expensive investments in infrastructure in the places where we have troops based in Europe right now, and those are unlikely to shift anytime soon. I also don't think there'll be a further drawdown of the American presence in Europe, because we need those troops there for the current deployments that we're running outside of Europe and a number of other places. So I think some of this is sort of limited by reality, and of course President Trump probably not reading all the way down to the bottom of any of those memos, but I do think that he understands the point about the Russian threat. He may not agree with it always, and I think we have I have a lot of nervousness about what the rest of this week is going to look like.
What the rest of this week is going to look like. Let's talk about that, Molly McHugh. And before we talk about Helsinki and Monday when he sits down with Vladimir Putin, let's go back to that quip on Tuesday where he said that meeting Putin was actually the easy part. It was a part of a dig that seemed as much aimed at Theresa May as it was at NATO.
So I have NATO. I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil, and I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? Who would think? But the UK certainly has they have a lot of things going on.
Have you talked to Theresa May since Boris Johnson yet? And do you think...
I have not. No, I have not. But Boris Johnson's a friend of mine. He's been very, very nice to me, very supportive. And I maybe we'll speak to him when I get over there. I like Boris Johnson. I've always liked him.
Should Theresa May remain in power?
Well, that's up to the people. I get along with her very well, have a very good relationship. That's certainly up to the people, not up to me.
Those nice words for Boris Johnson. Dave Desroches, are we reading too much into it, or does that sound a lot like the President of the United States endorsing a hard Brexit?
Well, the first foreign visitor the president had after his election was Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party. And Boris Johnson, his personal track record is not entirely dissimilar from President Trump. So I imagine there's some simpatico-ness there. They're both larger than life figures. But I think what this reflects is you don't have to, if you look at Theresa May's body language, it's clear that she does not regard the idea of meeting with Trump, hosting Trump, as something, she'd probably be much happier meeting with George W. Bush or Barack Obama or just about anybody. And it does carry significant baggage for her. And I think he's pointing that out. And I think he's also making the point that her position is rather tenuous. And I think if you're looking at it from the point of view of the President of the United States, who has over 130 countries to worry about, why do you want to invest the time for a state visit with somebody who may not be in power in 3 months? So I wouldn't read too much from it. There is a strain of thought in the United States, and I think it is popular among Trump's advisor, that the EU is inherently hostile to American interests. And I do share this when it comes to the duplicative military capacity of the EU. But I think this is much more about interpersonal stuff.
Annick Cizel, you agree?
Well, first of all, it's not a state visit. And both sides of the Atlantic have been very careful to call it a working visit, because it's been so hard to organize, because the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is not lending London as the capital city of England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, for a state visit, has allowed all these demonstrations to take place, including, you showed pictures earlier, that big blimp, which is going to be in the skies of London during Donald Trump's visit, forcing the President of the United States to sort of dodge London and meet the Queen somewhere. I don't know if you know where, but it's the best held secret in Europe right now, possibly scooting up to his golf course in Scotland to try and avoid the demonstrations, to try and avoid the fact there's even no political consensus, as you were pointing at. He's endorsed Boris Johnson, who most definitely, in this show of confidence, I was going to say, a show of defiance against Theresa May right now, if the Conservative Party is not playing into the hands of the Labour Party with this, definitely Boris Johnson, I would think, is trying to take the leadership of the Conservative Party as a sort of internal coup d'etat here against the current Prime Minister. As a foreign leader, President Trump has no business, I'm sorry to say, to endorse a potential contender for the leadership of Great Britain.
There was the new U.S. ambassador to Britain last Saturday, quoted in the front page of one of the tabloids, offering a zero tariff trade deal with the U.K., which seemed aimed, because we are in the midst of a budding trade war now between the European Union and the United States. It seemed like a dig at the EU, did it not?
Yes, and it's also a sort of, indirect blow to the end of the discussions on Brexit, because what Prime Minister May has dragged her government towards is keeping the commitment of UK within the trade agreements of the EU. So she wouldn't have any freedom to negotiate and to separate a trade deal for UK separately before at least 2021. So that's simply a joke.
Molly McHugh, before Donald Trump then travels to Helsinki to meet Vladimir Putin, the Russian president will be meeting his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, who will be in Moscow for, let's remind our viewers, the final of the World Cup, where France is participating. What should Macron be telling Putin?
I would never tell the French president what to say. I think look, he's been up and down in my mind on his relationship with Russia. I think he's trying to play a smart, realist line. His first meeting with Putin, where he invited Putin to France and sort of welcomed him, but then was very stern in messaging, I interpreted very well. I like the going to Russia, kissing up about the World Cup, we're all besties now stuff a lot less. I think Putin has gotten a huge PR bump out of the World Cup and this sort of idea of Russia as a normal place where everything is fine and everything bad about Russia is just bad press from crazy Russophobes. So I hesitate about any of these things. I think that the World Cup is the World Cup and the World Cup will go on and that's fine. But I hope that there's more serious discussion about the very real security threats coming from Russia, about yet another sort of Novichok moment in the UK that needs to be addressed, the essentially expanding Russian occupation in Ukraine with the activities that they've been up to in the Sea of Azov during the World Cup. I think now it's up to 14. It's either 12 or 14 Ukrainians that have been killed during the World Cup. The expanded bombing runs in Syria. There's an awful lot for everybody to talk about, and I certainly hope that President Macron will.
So, Dave Desroches, will the U.S. president be on message in Helsinki, or will he go rogue?
What is on message, what is rogue with Donald Trump? Hard to tell. In many ways, the most unpredictable aspects of a very unpredictable presidency are his public remarks with Russia. I don't think there was anybody who was not surprised by his call at the G7 for Russia to be admitted to the G8. And I still scratch my head over this because there was absolutely nothing to be gained from that. So the president has fooled the experts before, and he's likely to do it again. I think, though, that he's not going to get protests. He's not going to have to see protests against him in Helsinki the way he will in London. And given that ego plays a big part in this, that does indicate that we might see a result that, quite frankly, nobody in the West really wants to see. But I think he will definitely be briefed on all of Russia's malfeasance, and I think that he will be pressed and prepared to expose, Russia's bad behavior. But the question is whether he'll fall through with it or whether he'll just rely on his instinct.
And we'll be covering it here on France 24. Dave Desroches, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. Ditto from Molly McHugh, always a pleasure. Annick Cizel, Alain Richard. Alain Richard, remind me, who was defense minister the last time France won the World Cup?
That was me.
That was you,
and
indeed.
I still had the responsibility of the gendarmerie, so I was also in charge of public security. That was crazy. But it finished well.
I think your presence here tonight will surely be a good omen come Sunday. I want to thank you for joining us here, and our World Cup Daily is up next, by the way.